It was supposed to be a celebration, the kind that gets broadcast across the nation, replayed in classrooms, stitched into inspiration reels, and quoted in commencement speeches. The auditorium was packed, the lights warm but commanding, and in the center of it all stood Elizabeth Warren, framed perfectly by two towering LED screens bearing the words, "Rising from Nothing." She took the stage not as a politician today, but as a hero of resilience, a beacon for the thousands of young minds gathered in that room. Her voice carried the practiced grace of someone who's told this story before. A childhood of scarcity, hand-me-down shoes, food stamps, nights spent studying by the flicker of a single lamp. And as she spoke, something fascinating happened. The room leaned in, physically. She had them. You could feel it. They weren't just listening. They were absorbing, believing, storing her words somewhere private, hoping that maybe her past would unlock their future. Cameras panned across tear-streaked faces. One girl clutched her notepad to her chest. A boy mouthed, "Wow," to his friend. On screen, archival footage of Warren's old neighborhood played in the background. Modest homes, a dusty front yard, a black-and-white photo of a young girl who looked just like the woman now commanding the stage. "You see," Warren said, her tone now laced with triumph. "We didn't have much. But what we did have was grit. And grit, my friends, is something no one can take from you." Thunderous applause followed. Students shot to their feet. It was everything an event planner dreams of. Everything except one man in the fourth row who hadn't clapped once. Senator John Kennedy sat with his hands folded. Calm. Still. Observing like someone who wasn't watching a speech, but a strategy. As the crowd's energy peaked, a volunteer passed him a folded note, hurriedly scribbled by someone backstage. He didn't react, didn't even blink, just opened it slowly and read. Then he looked up at the stage. Not with scorn, not with skepticism, just something quieter, something closer to disappointment. You see, there's a particular stillness that only comes when a person sees past the performance and into the intent. And in that moment, it felt like Kennedy saw something the rest of the room missed. The host, a grinning moderator from a national education non-profit, stepped back up to the mic. "Let's open the floor for some reflections," he beamed. "We're lucky enough to have Senator John Kennedy with us today. Senator, care to share a few thoughts?" For the briefest beat, it felt like Kennedy wouldn't rise. And then he did, slowly, like the weight of what he was about to say had earned gravity. The room quieted, not out of fear, but because a different kind of attention had entered. One that doesn't chase applause, but cuts through it. He walked to the podium, paper still in hand. "What a remarkable story," he began, his southern lilt soft, nearly disarming. "Growing up with so little, working hard, succeeding despite the odds, that's the kind of story America loves." A few students nodded. "But," he continued, and now the room stiffened, "I do have one question." He unfolded the note again, even though he didn't need to. His eyes had memorized what he needed to say. "If growing up poor taught you humility," he said slowly, "why are you using it to prove you're better than everyone else?" The words didn't land like an insult. They landed like a mirror, held up so gently it took the room a full second to realize they were looking at themselves too. The moderator blinked. Warren didn't move. You could hear the whir of a nearby camera zooming in. The students who'd clapped moments ago now sat frozen, processing not the question's tone, but its truth. Because it wasn't about her poverty. It was about the performance. And if you're still watching right now, if you felt that shift in your chest like we did, do me one favor. Hit the like button and drop a simple 9 in the comments, because we're just getting started. And this story is about to break wide open. Elizabeth Warren stood still behind the podium, her fingers resting lightly on the edge, as if the wood beneath them could anchor her. The room, seconds ago filled with roaring applause, was now so quiet you could hear someone shift in their seat 3 rows back. Her lips parted slightly, maybe to answer, maybe just to breathe. But no words came. And in that suspended moment, something changed, not just in the room, but in the air. The kind of shift that doesn't scream but hums, low and dangerous, like a storm cloud forming behind calm skies. Senator Kennedy, still standing, didn't move to fill the silence. He didn't smirk, didn't glance at the cameras. He simply stepped back, folding the note back into his pocket like it didn't carry the weight of 1,000 unseen questions. Then, without waiting for permission, he walked off the stage and returned to his seat. It should have ended there. The moment could have passed, labeled a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding, one man's cynicism against another's triumph. But it didn't, because moments like that don't end. They multiply. And this one, in particular, ignited something the event organizers hadn't prepared for. The clip hit Twitter first, posted by a student in the 4th row. No caption, just a 5-second video. Kennedy's question, Warren's pause, and the silence that followed. Within an hour, it had 300,000 views. By nightfall, it was on TikTok, stitched with montages of celebrity interviews, influencer speeches, and YouTubers telling their "I started with nothing" stories. Except this time, the background audio was Kennedy's voice. If growing up poor taught you humility, why are you using it to prove you're better than everyone else? The comment sections didn't explode with hate. They whispered with reflection. Some users called it brave. Others called it cruel. But no one ignored it, because it wasn't just about Elizabeth Warren anymore. It was about all the curated pain, all the branded vulnerability people had come to expect in every TED Talk and every Instagram caption. This was different. It didn't accuse, it asked. And that question hit something deeper than political division. It struck the heart of a cultural truth. We've turned suffering into stagecraft. Meanwhile, the original organizers of the event scrambled. Emails flew. PR teams drafted statements. One intern suggested editing out the Q&A section from the official recording. But it was too late. The internet had already claimed the raw version as canon. And that night, something even more unexpected happened. A YouTube livestream popped up titled "The Question That Changed the Room," hosted by a 23-year-old political science grad from Ohio. She wasn't famous, her lighting was bad, but her take was razor sharp. "We're not angry because the question was mean," she said to 600 live viewers. "We're shaken because the question was honest. When does sharing your pain stop being vulnerable and start being a performance?" In the next 3 hours, her stream jumped to 20,000 views. But while the world online dissected and debated, something else began to unravel offline. A former classmate of Warren's posted a scanned yearbook page showing an old quote under her name. "Someday, I'll tell my story, and it'll open doors they said were closed." No malice, no deception, just a teenage dream written in ink. But paired with the current narrative, it added fuel to a fire no one had planned to start. Suddenly, journalists began digging, not to accuse, but to explore. Was this an isolated moment? Or had storytelling become strategy? Had sincerity been replaced with scripting? Back at the Capitol, Kennedy said nothing. No press conference, no tweets. When asked for comment by a major outlet, his office replied with just 4 words. "The senator stands by it." That was it. No elaboration, no defense, just a quiet confirmation that the question was intentional and final. And that silence, again, said more than any rebuttal could. Warren, to her credit, didn't launch a counterattack. In a brief appearance the next day, she returned to a podium, this time for a policy talk on education funding. Her tone was steady, but her eyes carried a weight that hadn't been there before. She didn't mention the event, didn't reference the viral moment, but everyone in the room felt it lingering like fog. She was trying to pivot, to move forward. But the story behind her, crafted, practiced, perhaps even rehearsed, was now being seen with new eyes, and the people watching weren't just listening anymore. They were questioning. Because sometimes, it's not the story that breaks you. It's the moment when someone finally asks why you're telling it. The next morning, what started as a momentary spark became a full-blown cultural firestorm. Newsrooms were scrambling, not over policy, not over scandal, but over a question. A single sentence from a Southern senator had somehow hijacked the national narrative. Was it humility or performance? Became the unofficial headline across dozens of platforms. CNN ran a morning segment replaying the clip in slow motion. On Fox News, the question was dissected by a panel of commentators who usually couldn't agree on what day it was. But this time, they all nodded. Not at Kennedy's tone, but at his precision. It was the kind of moment politics usually avoids. Something real. By midday, the clip had breached the digital echo chamber and entered a place no one expected. Classrooms. A community college in Oregon projected the moment during a media literacy lecture. A communications professor in Chicago played it before starting a lesson on narrative credibility. And perhaps most telling of all, a high school teacher in Georgia replaced their Friday writing prompt with one simple line on the board. When is storytelling truth? And when is it branding? Students stared at the sentence, quiet at first. Then one girl raised her hand and said, "Maybe when you expect something in return, it stops being truth." Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren's team was under siege, not from reporters, but from silence. Her inbox wasn't filled with hate mail, it was filled with confusion. Emails from supporters asking for context, for answers, for something to explain what they'd heard. But how do you respond to a question that didn't accuse you of lying, only of rethinking why you told the truth? By Friday evening, her office released a carefully worded statement. Senator Warren is proud of her journey and will continue sharing her experiences to inspire future generations. It was polished, it was safe, and it landed with all the impact of a balloon in a thunderstorm. Because the public wasn't asking for inspiration, they were asking for clarity. The real twist came that night. A podcast host, relatively unknown with fewer than 5,000 followers, posted a late-night reaction titled, "When Grit Becomes a Brand." In it, she said, "There's a difference between telling your story to connect with people and telling your story to elevate yourself above them." Kennedy didn't shame her. He just asked her to consider who the story was really for. That podcast, raw and recorded in one take, hit 1 million listens by Sunday. But that wasn't the only shock. An old friend of Warren's, a woman who had shared a dorm with her in college, posted a handwritten letter Warren had once sent during a scholarship rejection. In it, she had written, "I'll make them see my struggle. I'll learn how to shape it. That's how you change minds." The letter wasn't malicious. It wasn't fake. But in the current context, it painted a different picture. Not of deception, but of calculation. The kind that doesn't break rules, but bends perception. At this point, Kennedy still hadn't said a word. And that silence had become louder than any headline. On Meet the Nation, a political analyst finally asked the question aloud. Why does this moment matter so much? The answer came not from another pundit, but from a guest speaker, a young psychology professor from NYU. Because in an age of curated everything, she said, a question that exposes motive, not just message, feels like truth, and people are starving for truth. And just when it seemed like the storm had peaked, It twisted again. A student from the original event, the one where Warren had delivered her powerful speech, posted a short video on Instagram. He spoke directly into the camera. "I cried when she told her story," he said. "I believed every word. But when Senator Kennedy asked that question, I realized I didn't feel inspired anymore. I felt managed." The video got 4.6 million views in 24 hours. Back in Washington, Senator Kennedy was spotted walking out of a local bookstore carrying a worn copy of Letters to a Young Poet. When a journalist approached him and asked if he would elaborate on his question, he simply said, "No. I asked what I needed to ask." And that was it. But what lingered wasn't just his words. It was the feeling they left behind. The uncomfortable, undeniable feeling that maybe we've all applauded too many stories without ever asking what they were really for, and that maybe the most courageous thing someone can do in a room full of noise is to ask one quiet, necessary question. By the time the weekend rolled around, the question had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't just a viral moment or a political ripple. It had become a cultural checkpoint. Everywhere you looked, people weren't debating facts. They were debating intent. The story had spilled far beyond Elizabeth Warren and John Kennedy. It was now about how we all present ourselves to the world and why. College students recorded dorm room monologues unpacking the ethics of inspirational branding. TikTok creators layered Kennedy's voice over slow pans of motivational influencers, captioned with, "Was it humility or a highlight reel?" The phrase itself became a trend. "Why are you telling it?" was printed on t-shirts, coffee mugs, even graffiti in an Austin alleyway. But what truly shocked everyone wasn't the memes or the merchandise. It was what came next from inside Warren's own camp. On Monday morning, a former staffer leaked an internal memo from a past campaign. Its subject line read simply, "Story optimization. Personal hardship messaging." The contents weren't explosive, but they were cold. Bullet points about when to insert the single mother reference, how to structure the working two jobs timeline, and which media outlets responded best to which versions of the story. There was even a line that read, "Pause after we couldn't afford the doctor." It gives the audience space to emotionally react. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't illegal. But it confirmed what Kennedy's question had only implied, that the story had been shaped, polished, focus grouped. And in that moment, all the emotion people had once felt about her words now bent into something else. Discomfort. Not because she had suffered, but because her suffering had been scheduled. That same day, a renowned ethics professor from Stanford posted a Twitter thread that went viral in under 3 hours. "There's nothing wrong with telling your story," it began. "What matters is whether you're doing it to build bridges or build yourself a pedestal." Thousands of retweets followed. People shared their own versions of misused narratives, job interviews where they'd been told to exaggerate hardship, scholarship applications that asked for trauma-based storytelling, moments where their truth felt manipulated into a marketable asset. And then came the collapse. Warren appeared on a daytime talk show, intending to reset the tone. The host welcomed her warmly, and the segment started light. But 10 minutes in, the topic turned. "You've inspired so many people," the host said gently. "But I have to ask, do you ever worry that people are inspired by the version of you they've been sold, not the real one?" Warren blinked. For just a second, her confident posture faltered. She gave a soft laugh and replied, "I've always tried to tell the truth about where I came from. It should have been safe." But the audience didn't clap. No applause, no reaction. Just silence. That silence again had become the signal. By nightfall, the network pulled the clip offline. Comments had flooded the post, not with anger, but with doubt. She didn't answer. She dodged it again. "Why is this so hard to say directly?" Meanwhile, Kennedy still hadn't spoken publicly, but a quiet video surfaced online, filmed by a college student in a Mississippi diner. Kennedy was sitting alone, reading a book with a glass of iced tea. When asked if he would ever follow up on the question, he looked up and said, "A real question doesn't need a sequel. It just needs to be heard." Then he went back to reading. That line, "A real question doesn't need a sequel," became the next wave of viral reaction. It was quoted in college essays, turned into wallpaper backgrounds, stitched into Reddit bios. And then came the final blow. An editor at a popular online magazine published a long-form piece titled "The Myth Machine: How Personal Pain Became Public Currency." It didn't name Warren, it didn't mention Kennedy, but it dissected the evolution of storytelling in modern leadership, drawing a line from televised speeches to influencer culture, from memoirs to Instagram captions. Its conclusion was simple, brutal, and impossible to forget. When people stop asking why you tell your story, they stop caring if it's true. And just like that, the conversation changed again. Not into outrage, not into cancellation, but into something rarer: recalibration. A national moment where audiences stopped clapping and started asking, where students began dissecting authenticity like they would a case study, where leaders realized that vulnerability without humility is just theater. And through it all, Kennedy never raised his voice, never pointed a finger, never demanded attention. He had simply asked the question, one sentence, spoken plainly, left hanging. And somehow, that silence had done what no campaign, no article, no confession ever could. It made the country pause. Because when a story breaks, the question isn't always who's lying. Sometimes it's who's listening. By midweek, the dust hadn't settled. It had transformed. What began as a simple exchange on a student stage had now become a national meditation, not on politics or policy, but on purpose. The conversation had shifted again, this time away from Warren's personal brand and toward a broader, deeper question. How many of us are performing the pain we once endured? Not faking it, but framing it, optimizing it, packaging it for praise. The internet wasn't just replaying the Kennedy moment, they were replaying their own. Everywhere, people began reassessing the stories they once shared freely. Influencers pulled down old posts with captions like, "From rock bottom to CEO," replacing them with simple notes. Relearning how to be real. A best-selling author canceled her speaking tour after admitting she had exaggerated the details of her childhood trauma in her memoir. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the topic, with hosts opening up about how social media had rewarded not growth, but wounds. "The deeper the scar," one host confessed, "the more engagement I got." Back at the Capitol, Kennedy walked through the halls as if nothing had happened. No press swarm, no media stunt, just the same slow, steady gait, nodding to janitors and interns like it was any other Thursday. One journalist caught up with him near an elevator and asked, "Senator, did you expect your question to cause this kind of conversation?" Kennedy paused before stepping inside. "I didn't expect anything," he said. "I just didn't want to clap when something didn't feel right." The elevator doors closed, leaving only the echo of those words behind. In the world outside, Warren's team struggled to regain footing. No scandal had taken her down. Only a silence she couldn't fill. Her next appearance was a university keynote. The event had been booked months before, back when she was the headliner everyone wanted for her inspirational rise. But when she walked onto that stage, the atmosphere was different. Polite applause, no thunder, cameras still rolled, but the spark was missing, and that's when it hit everyone watching. The issue wasn't whether Warren had told the truth. It was that people no longer trusted why. Halfway through the speech, a student stood up quietly in the back row, holding a small piece of paper. Without raising his voice, he asked, Do you think your pain was something we needed? Or something you needed us to need? The question floated there, delicate and devastating. Warren blinked, her lips parting, but again no answer came. Not because she didn't have one, but because anything she said would now sound like spin. The crowd didn't boo. They didn't cheer. They just watched. And that might have been the most painful part of all. That moment, filmed from 3 different phones, was online within the hour. One clip was captioned, "The ripple continues." Another simply read, "Intent matters." The video spread like wildfire, not because it was shocking, but because it felt inevitable. It was no longer about Warren. It was about the mirror she now unintentionally held up to everyone who'd ever tried to turn hurt into a headline. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the internet, a long-form blog post went viral. Written by a college junior studying narrative psychology, it was titled, "The Echo Chamber of Empathy." It began with Kennedy's question and spiraled outward into a dissection of what we reward culturally. How platforms boost pain, how audiences crave backstories, how even authenticity becomes a kind of currency. When we stopped asking, "Are you okay?" and started asking, "How did you overcome?" Chapeau. We began expecting people to turn trauma into TED Talks, the author wrote. The essay ended with a challenge. What if we didn't need the story? What if we just needed each other? By Friday, an editorial in the New York Times closed the loop. Titled "The Sound of One Question," it praised neither Kennedy nor condemned Warren. Instead, it acknowledged the rare power of public silence. In an age where everyone is shouting to be heard, it said, a whisper that asks the right question becomes unforgettable. The final sentence read, "Perhaps the real takeaway isn't who answered, but who dared to listen." And that's exactly what this had become. A moment that asked us not to cancel, not to accuse, but to reflect, to reframe how we consume, and more importantly, how we confess. Because somewhere along the line, pain became a performance. And nobody noticed until someone refused to clap. Kennedy didn't write a follow-up. He didn't tweet a thread. He simply kept doing what he'd always done, listening more than speaking. And that restraint, in a world obsessed with reactions, became its own kind of revolution. The conversation wasn't over, but it had matured. It had left the stage, left the comment sections, and entered living rooms, classrooms, boardrooms. Not as gossip, but as a question we all now carried. Not just for Warren, but for ourselves. Why do we tell the stories we tell? And are we sure we're not just telling them to be seen? Weeks had passed, but the question still lingered like a song stuck in the nation's subconscious. It had been dissected, reworded, quoted, and debated, but never answered. Not really. And perhaps that was its power. Senator Kennedy hadn't issued a takedown or delivered a mic drop. He'd done something much harder. He'd left space. And in that space, people found themselves thinking more slowly, more deeply than they had in years. One Saturday afternoon, a small liberal arts college in Vermont held a campus-wide forum titled "The Ethics of Storytelling." It wasn't about Elizabeth Warren specifically, though her name was brought up more than once. It was about something bigger, the moment when sharing becomes shaping. The panelists weren't celebrities or politicians. They were students, professors, community organizers. One of them, an English major, stood at the mic and said, "We're all guilty of polishing our stories, but the danger comes when the polish replaces the truth." That quote made its way to Twitter within minutes. Not viral, not trending, but quietly passed from person to person like a note folded and slipped under a door. Meanwhile, in Baton Rouge, Kennedy gave a commencement address at a local high school. There were no national cameras, no media trucks, just folding chairs, proud parents, and teenagers in oversized gowns. He didn't mention Warren, not once. But he spoke about silence. About how real questions don't always come with applause. Sometimes, he told the graduating class, you'll be in a room where everyone's clapping and something inside you doesn't want to join in. That doesn't make you wrong. That might just make you honest. The students didn't cheer wildly. They just sat still, listening. That stillness had become a pattern. Across the country, motivational speakers noticed a shift. Audiences weren't reacting the same way. The applause felt lighter, less automatic. A few speakers even shared in interviews that they were rethinking how they told their own stories. One said, "For years I leaned on a moment of personal tragedy to start every keynote. Now I'm asking myself, was I trying to connect, or was I trying to be unforgettable?" It was a question no PR coach could answer. Only conscience could. Elizabeth Warren, for her part, continued her work. She returned to Capitol hearings, education panels, grassroots events. She didn't resign. She didn't disappear. But she was quieter now, more measured. She still told her story, but with less theater, fewer crescendos. Some called it damage control. Others called it growth. No one knew for sure. But even her supporters admitted something had shifted. Her words had changed, not their meaning, but their weight. And in that weight, something strange happened. Respect returned. Not blind loyalty, not viral praise. Just a subtle respect for someone who didn't run when the questions got hard, who didn't lash out, didn't deflect, didn't rewrite the narrative in her favor. She absorbed it, sat with it. That too takes a kind of strength. The media moved on, as it always does. New scandals, new speeches, new distractions. But tucked beneath the noise, that question kept echoing. It wasn't printed on headlines anymore. It had embedded itself in people. The best kind of question, the kind that doesn't need repeating because it never really leaves. And maybe that's why it mattered. Because in a world addicted to noise, Senator John Kennedy reminded us of the power of stillness. In a culture trained to clap at every heartbreak, he reminded us to pause and ask, why is this being shared? What is it asking of me? And what's the difference between honesty and performance? In the end, no careers were destroyed. No one was canceled. But something did break. The assumption that every story deserves a standing ovation just because it's sad. And in its place, a new standard quietly emerged, one rooted in intent, not intensity. So now it's your turn. Before you clap, before you repost, before you quote someone's pain as inspiration, ask yourself, are you celebrating their truth or their storytelling? Are you connecting with them or consuming them? If you've followed this far, if something in your chest stirred even once during this story, then maybe you're one of the rare few who's not just listening, but hearing. And in a world this loud, that might just be the loudest thing of all.